honestly, if that didn't sell you on the game, I don't know what will. It's still a little early to say whether or not it's right up there with Elden Ring for me, but frankly speaking, this game has a really solid grind to it, while the gameplay itself is just innately fun and cathartic. So first I wanted to break apart the different modes and tell you guys and gals about the positives and negatives. First of all, there is a campaign, a main story, if you will, and it's very serviceable. I don't really know much about Warhammer 40k lore or anything like that, but I know fans probably appreciate the story way more because they actually know what's going on. A lot of the story won't really handhold you or explain like what certain characters' roles are in this universe, and I'm okay with that because the story moves at a very brisk pace. It's got a lot of eye candy and a lot of spectacle, but again, the gameplay is just so unbelievably tight that I had a blast going through it. Now, while the campaign might be what I would consider a one and done, that pain is a little bit alleviated by the fact that you can play this with 3 total players, including the host. It took me around 8 hours to get through the campaign, but the real meat of the game is going to be the Operations and Eternal War, which is respectively the PvE and PvP modes. Just to put it into perspective, in the story mode, your character that you're playing as, the main character, Titus, is basically playing as the assault class in the game, but as soon as you branch off into the multiplayer modes, you'll have 6 total classes to choose from. Now, I've already got a beginner's guide that goes over each of the details of the different classes, but suffice to say, there is a lot to learn here. In the operations mode in particular, you'll just rerun the same missions over and over again, and once you get your character strong enough, you can essentially bump up to a higher difficulty, which will give you more resources to upgrade your character further. But you'll also be able to upgrade the weapons that you're using. It incentivizes you to experiment, but because the XP grind is quite slow, you might want to stick with like 1 or 2 different classes at first before you start branching off. That said, before you even decide what your main is, I would suggest that you experiment and find one that you enjoy. It's not necessarily like a full-on RPG, it's kind of just a linear progression, but the fact is you are gaining XP, which makes the expeditions feel meaningful. And the further you get into the perk tree, the more unique and refined your build and playstyle can get. And don't think that you have to have friends to be able to enjoy it, because you can play it alone and be perfectly fine. Like, I love playing this game with randoms, at least when they're not like brain dead. At the surface, it might just seem like a generic third-person shooter with dive rolling, but the fact is there's a little bit of Souls-like combat to it because you get iframes for dive rolling as well as executions. Executing enemies will also heal your shield. You won't heal your health unless you end up getting like a stim pack, but it begs you to play it very aggressively and be right in the thick of it, especially because the melee combat is just so extremely fleshed out. Most melee weapons will have a 4-hit attack combo, but you can also block enemies and perfect block enemies, which will result in a parry, which usually lets you shoot the dude in the face for heaps of damage, as well as restoring some of your armor. Suffice to say that the combat is surprisingly deep, and if there's one thing that I would criticize, it's that I think the game doesn't do a very good job explaining all of these mechanics to you. I'm 30 hours in, and I'm still figuring out the nuances of each of the different classes that the game never told me about. Now, I'm making this review based on the PC version of the game, which is extremely well optimized. There's some frame dips here and there, but not really anything super noticeable, which is crazy to think in this day and age, a PC game that comes out and actually runs well? What? It also came right out of the gate completely crossplay with all console versions? What? The worst aspect of the game is by far the loading screens. They are brutally long regardless of an SSD. I understand it has to do with the fancy graphics and probably because I have crossplay on, but I still wish they would optimize it a bit. At its worst, you'll load into a mission, have your team wipe, and then you'll have to load back into the ship just so you can restart the mission again. But at its best, you usually just have to deal with the load time of going into the mission and the load time after the victory screen. The roadmap also looks very promising, adding all of the meaningful content to the game for free, with the season pass only giving you cosmetic items. And while the roadmap doesn't mention it, the developers have confirmed that they do want to add new classes to the game. They just don't want to be under a time crunch and instead want to take their time and listen to the community feedback to who they should add next. We don't get video games like this very often anymore. The video game industry as a whole has gotten very, very good at playing it safe in order to maximize profits. Space Marine takes a lot of risks, and every single one of them deserves to be rewarded and recognized. Because Space Marine 2 does something that most AAA games are afraid of. It's actually fun. So in the end, do I recommend it? Obviously I do. Honestly, in my opinion, this game is a masterpiece. I went in with zero expectations and was completely blown away. This is definitely making it onto my Game of the Year list.